Good morning. We moved you all here because we thought there would be more room to dance on the other side, so don't be surprised if we pull some more of those stunts. Thank you for attending this session. Finn and I believe that one of the fundamental requirements of just about any sail training organisation and port organisation is the ability to recruit, manage and retain volunteers, and that is fundamental to what we all do. We'll present some elementary research to you that supports that contention, and argue that the management of volunteers is synonymous with the personal development of sail trainees. These are two different aspects of the same thing, and the skills to do one give us the skills to do the other. We'll also provide some theoretical insight into how to go about that retention, recruitment and management, and Finn will provide an excellent case study on the way in which the management of volunteers and the recruitment of volunteers in Dublin was handled. For those of you who blanch at the thought of anything being theoretical, I'd suggest that there is nothing as practical as a good theory. It's something that you can apply time and time again, and that the distinction between theory and practice is an artificial one. We would prefer, if you could, to hold questions until the end of the session. If there's something that we say that you don't understand, either because of my peculiar use of English or because Finn is speaking too fast or whatever, please stop us and we'll be happy to explain. But we'd rather hold the questions and discussions until the end of the session if we may. The power of volunteers is really quite considerable. This is a shot of the bark James Craig in 1972 in Research Bay, in the very south part of Tasmania, and she'd been like this for about 40 years. The locality is wonderful. Behind this ship are the Harz Mountains. The water is crystal clear. You walk around this place with a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc or a decent bottle of Semillon in one hand and a screwdriver in the other hand, because the oysters are as big as the palm of your hand and you just chisel them off the rocks, get yourself a feed and go on. But this is pretty desolate. This is about 20 miles from the nearest road and a long way from any power. This is what the interior of the ship looked like. You can see 20 years of coal dust being hosed out of the bottom of this ship. And the decks, which had been burnt off, there's no wood on these at all, the rigging, which is entirely removed, and the interior of the hull. To raise the ship, about 1,000 holes of something like a metre across were plugged, and they were plugged with everything from real estate agents' boards to bits of steel. There were welders standing in the water up to their chests with a welding rod tacking sheets of metal on this. Not a very clever thing to do. If you, well, it's quite a clever thing to do to get a feed of fish. You just dip the end of the rod in the water and stun all the fish for some distance around. But you're likely to kill yourself if you do it too often. The volunteers who were involved in this, and this was entirely a volunteer perspective, transformed that into this. Now, that is entirely, or just about entirely, a volunteer effort. And the reason I'm using this as an example is because this was an organisation that I was lucky enough to be involved in, and it's a very real demonstration of the power of volunteers. But I'll give you some other examples. The London 2012 Olympics. I understand that something like 70,000 volunteers were involved in that, and that they made the games. Certainly this headline from the Telegraph yesterday would suggest that that was the case. My own experience in Sydney was, and the 2000 Olympics, was that the volunteers certainly made those games. That was the best two-week party I ever had in my life. I hope the experience in the UK was exactly the same. A lot of that was down to the volunteers. It really, really was. And as Finn pointed out earlier on, you couldn't have paid those volunteers. 70,000 volunteers with any form of significant remuneration or appropriate remuneration would just have made the whole thing too costly. Excuse me a second. The other things, or some of the other things that volunteers do is, as you know, sail ships throughout the world, but they also build and restore vessels. It may not be apparent to you that probably the world's second or third largest navy is entirely volunteer run and based in the United States. Volunteers in the United States maintain 5 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 20 destroyers, 20 submarines, and God knows how many patrol boats. I mean, you just look at that lot and think, this is incredible. I have no idea why it's necessary to have 5 aircraft carriers or 4 battleships maintained, but they're doing it. And essentially that's a volunteer effort. Not completely, but essentially. The list of other things which volunteers routinely do here is really quite considerable. And you'll add your own examples to these, I'm sure. Volunteers feed millions and millions of people each day. They house people. In Australia, there are about a third of the population, 36% of the population volunteer. And that proportion is going up. The value of that is put at something like 14.6 million. That's a significant underestimate. Voluntary organisations in Australia raise funds to the tune of about 8% of Australian gross domestic product. That's a colossal proportion of industry as a whole. And as you will have noticed, the power of volunteers was evident in the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States. There was a colossal volunteer effort in that. I hope by going through that, what I've persuaded you of, if you didn't already know, and I'm sure most of you did, is that volunteers are an extraordinarily powerful force, and that with volunteers we can do just about anything. If you can take a ship like the James Craig from a wreck to a sailing vessel, it's entirely possible. We did some research, and for those of you who were kind enough to return the fairly small questionnaire that we sent out, thank you very much indeed. I don't pretend that this research is statistically representative, but I don't have the information about the whole population to be able to prove that one way or the other. But it does give us a snapshot of the role of volunteers within organisations. This slide here shows the number of people, the number of organisations up here, and across the bottom here is the number of volunteers involved in each organisation. And they're colour-coded. So this column here is 0 to 49 volunteers per organisation. This column here is over 500 volunteers in one organisation. The mean, the average for any organisation is that there's something like 130 to 180 volunteers involved in every sail training organisation which responded to this question. The most frequently reported number of volunteers was 0 to 49. There was only one organisation which had no volunteers at all, and that was a sail training organisation in Australia, which is run by the Royal Australian Navy. I think that those responses represent about 14% of the total number of sail training organisations in the world. But as I say, I'm not very clear about the overall statistics for the population as a whole. What do they do? Well, most of the things that you'd expect them to do. The top 4 here are seagoing crew, maintenance, fundraising and training. The bottom, as you'd probably have thought, are management, admin, accounting and public relation or government relations. It's of some slight surprise that there weren't more volunteers involved in governance and board members. I'd have thought probably just about every organisation had got volunteer board members. Maybe that was the way I asked the question. I don't know. It's also no surprise that things like management and accounting, where there's a requirement for an absolute consistency of effort, tend to be things which are done by staff. Doesn't mean that volunteers aren't involved in those functions, but unless you've got somebody who can volunteer 2-3 days a week or what have you, it's difficult to maintain your books and your accounts in good order. No surprise at all that volunteers are involved in training, given the functions of the organisation as a whole. We also asked operators what they would like to do. Do you want to increase your volunteers? Have you got enough? And of the 19 organisations which answered this, 17 wanted to increase their number of volunteers. Only 2 didn't want to increase or reduce them, and none of them wanted to reduce the number of volunteers. And so we draw from this that there is a likelihood that the number of volunteers is going to increase, and the complexities and the demands of managing and recruiting them will therefore become greater. So this is, don't regard this as the beginning. This is, don't regard this as the end. This is probably only the beginning of where we need to be in terms of additional volunteers. We also compared this with the number of staff that organisations had. Usually because staff and volunteers are not the opposite ends of a spectrum, but an organisation with a small number of staff is likely to have a larger number of volunteers, and vice versa. Not always the case, but this is what we found out. 20 organisations employed between 0 and 9 staff, and that the mean number of staff per organisation was between 2.6 and 9. So every sale training organisation, the average that every sale training organisation had was somewhere between 2.6 and 9 staff. These figures will overstate the number of staff because this is about counting heads. Some of these staff will be part-time and will be counted alongside full-time staff. So if anything, this over-represents the number of staff which are available in those organisations. Several organisations simply wrote back and said, we don't have any staff at all. We run the entire operation as a volunteer operation. The conclusion from this is, these are predominantly small organisations with few staff, and the likelihood is that they're highly dependent upon volunteers. Again, reinforces the point that volunteer management and recruitment is a highly important function for sale training organisations. We asked people, and we think this is probably the kind of greatest demonstration of what would happen if people had no volunteers. And the killer here is this. Half of the organisations, over half of the organisations that answered this questionnaire simply said we would cease to operate. If we didn't have volunteers, we would no longer be able to do what we're currently doing. Therefore, the management, recruitment and training of volunteers is a critical function. And that's a huge demonstration of that point. Of the rest of them, 3, no effect, but another 7 organisations reckon they would need to increase their income by somewhere between 10 and 50%. Trying to increase your income by 10 or 15% in the current financial climate would not be an easy task. Again, it reinforces the requirement that we need to be good at managing and recruiting volunteers. We asked people what the issues were, and that's what people came back with. Luckily, we found out that what we thought might be the problems and the way in which we designed the session were reinforced by the answers to this. Volunteers, difficulty in recruiting volunteers, retaining volunteers, and then reliability and the management of volunteers figured as the top 4 responses there. I'd suggest that the reliability of volunteers is a management issue, and so that simply goes back to the point about how you manage volunteers. We put in a couple of things here to find out whether there were any negatives here. Difficulty in managing volunteer behaviour. It happens occasionally. I'm sorry, there's a row of people laughing in the front row. I'll ask you to tell us what the incident was that gave rise to that later on. But occasionally volunteer behaviour becomes challenging to the organisation. It's likely that where you find 2 organisations existing in the same space, doing the same thing, there has been some policy disagreement between volunteers at an early stage, and that's why there are 2 organisations rather than 1. So volunteer behaviour or disagreements between volunteers sometimes drive the structure of volunteer organisations within an industry or an area of operation. Volunteers who believe they know everything, I put that in because that was a particular experience I had running the Sydney Heritage Fleet. The fleet consists of 9 vessels, 9 operational vessels, about another 50 or 60 museum exhibits. They range from small speedboats to the 3-masted bark James Craig via a number of steam vessels and so on. Volunteers believing that they know everything was absolutely true because a number of them did. Our greatest expertise in terms of steam engineers were volunteers. Our greatest expertise in terms of riggers were volunteers, and so on and so forth. It's not necessarily a negative, though, on reflection, the way in which I phrase the question may make people think that it is. The other things that people listed, difficulty in finding STCW 95 qualified volunteers. Absolutely. If somebody's put themselves through that course and paid the cost of doing that, they're likely to want to try and recoup some of that expense. It makes them less likely to volunteer, I suspect. We have a couple of suggestions about ways in which you can obtain training for volunteers and may be able to provide free training or substantially discounted training which may assist you to gain some greater qualifications for your volunteer group. Capacity to manage volunteer, difficulty in recruiting sufficiently trained volunteers, long lead time for volunteers, looking for a long lead time to commit, people becoming, people hanging back about making decisions. Again, we'll address some of those issues when we come to the section on management. We asked people about volunteers and the advantages of volunteers, and this point, the first point, goes back to the point about the Olympics. We couldn't afford to pay volunteers. This is a double-edged sword. I think a number of trade unionists might argue that's your organisational problem. You should be employing staff to do this rather than making do with volunteers. So I think we need to be a bit careful about the use of that result, that response. Some tasks are better done by volunteers. I gave you an illustration of the steam engineers and the riggers. It's also true of riveters. We have built, or the Sydney Heritage Fleet has built, 3 riveted ships. There are no riveters in Australia. You can't get anybody to operate a rivet gun, and the OH&S conditions attached to it make it extraordinarily difficult. If you want to get something riveted in Australia, you come to the Sydney Heritage Fleet and their volunteer riveters do it. The comment about our volunteers are our best motivated workers. We had a great example of being taught to dance this morning, and there's a great expression. Dance like nobody's watching, sing like nobody's listening, work like you don't need the money. Well, the volunteers don't need the money. They're working for the love of it. And are extraordinarily well motivated. If you could have a paid workforce who turned up to work purely out of the commitment to that organisation, then you would have an extraordinarily well committed work group. And that's what we've got with volunteers. We start from a very high base in terms of volunteer commitment. Volunteers, constant source of feedback, ideas and feedback. Absolutely true. My experience is that volunteers believe that they have an absolute right to make suggestions about every part of the organisation all the time, and that occasionally that becomes quite challenging to manage. We'll make some suggestions about how that can be managed as well. Volunteers provide valuable links to the local community. Most volunteers, the stats that we've run and the surveys that I've done in Australia and some of the ones that I've looked at in the UK, suggest that if somebody volunteers for one organisation, they're also likely to volunteer for another. There's better than a 50% probability that there's somebody in the front row who volunteers for at least 10 organisations by the look of this, but it's likely that somebody volunteers for one will volunteer for more than one. Because of that role in terms of volunteering, it provides some enhanced links into the local community. We also looked at the total income for STOs, and 21 organisations answered this, so you can see that the mean income, the mean revenue, the total amount of money that these organisations received was just over $500,000, just under $530,000, and this is US dollars, so you can convert that into your own currency. But essentially these are small organisations with not a lot of money. We went on to ask organisations what was the value of their volunteers, and we could then run a couple of calculations which gave us some idea of what the financial value to each organisation was. I think there's some opportunities here. The size of these organisations is very small. If you look at the number of trainee opportunities these organisations are offering, then the cost per trainee is remarkably low. If you then start to look at the results that SAIL training organisations produce, these are highly financially efficient organisations. For each secondary school student that you are able to influence in terms of, let's say, their truancy behaviour or their capability or their desire to stay on in secondary education, to complete secondary education, or a reduction in recidivism amongst those people at risk of obtaining a criminal record, those social outcomes are worth huge amounts of money. Keeping a student at school until they complete their secondary education is worth to the state hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, the cost to a SAIL training organisation of achieving that outcome is in the order of $1,000. Won't work for everybody on that SAIL training organisation, but some of the people that go through our programs will achieve this outcome. There is starting to be discussions in Australia, but also in the UK, about social bonds. And this is government agencies starting to fund voluntary organisation on the basis of not what they do, but what their outcomes are. So if it's possible to prove by research that we reduce the number of people who drop out of school, for example, we can start to use that as a lever to produce specific amounts of money. And that development in funding might, in the future, open a way to some better coordinated funding of SAIL training organisations. I think if we compared SAIL training organisations and the cost per trainee with just about any other program, we'd find that this was extraordinarily cheap. Frankly, $1,000 compared with just about any, for just about any social program is ridiculously inexpensive. We should talk about inexpensive rather than cheap. I apologise for using that word. When we applied the value that people placed on their volunteers, and we asked people, you know, what proportion of your total revenue are your volunteers worth? And this is what people said. 7 organisations said between 0 and 10%, and that equates to $0 to $168,000. So all we've done here is to do the very simple math. 5 organisations, they said between 21 and 30%, and that's what that equates to, 1.192 million to 1.703 million, and so on. The total value of volunteers to all organisations is between 2.516 and 4.227 million. Now remember that the total value, the total revenue for all these organisations is just over 11 million, 11.12 million. The mean value to each organisation is somewhere between $120,000 and $204,000. And as a percentage, that's between 22% and 38.5%. So this goes back to reinforce the earlier answer to the question about what would you have to, if you did not have volunteers, what would you need to do in terms of raising your revenue? And the maths here seems to reinforce that. So, what do we conclude from this fairly simple survey? Large number of volunteers involved in each organisation, mean between 130 and 180, and that compares with staffing levels of between 2.6 and 9. So the multiples here are that there is somewhere between 15 and 20 times the number of staff. The volunteers represent between 15 and 20 times the number of staff. That means we need to have some efficient management of volunteers. And I'm not presuming that the staff are necessarily all the managers in this organisation, in these organisations, but they're likely to form some of them. That over half the STOs would cease to operate without their volunteers. It's therefore critical that we maintain our volunteers and we manage them effectively. I would contend that there are two ways that you can destroy a volunteer organisation. One is through financial impropriety. If volunteers believe that there is something financially improper going on in the organisation, they simply leave. There's no reason why they should stay. I'm volunteering my time. I do not wish to be associated with this organisation. They go. So financial governance becomes a critical positive factor here. And the other reason that the volunteers, I think, tend to leave is if there is an ineffective safety management program. If you start to kill your volunteers, they tend to leave. It's a fairly obvious correlation, I think, but nevertheless happens to be true. So financial propriety and safety are key aspects, and they're key aspects of all voluntary organisations, but even more so in our industry, in the SAIL training industry. 89% of STOs wanted to increase their volunteer numbers. So, as we said, this is something which is likely to increase. The topics that we included are the appropriate ones. The advantages of volunteers: less expense, better motivated, tasks better undertaken, and so on. And the value to the average STO of somewhere between 120 and 204,000. Okay, I hope by the end of that little bit of the presentation, we've convinced you that the management of volunteers is critical to the way in which STOs run, and that a lack of volunteers would be one of the factors which prevented the increase in size and development of STOs. All right, what do we do about it? Well, we need to recruit the best people for the job, and we'll talk about how we might go about that. Suggest that announcement get recruits. How many of you have heard somebody say, the question's asked, can we get a volunteer to do this? And the response comes back, well, I asked, but nobody was interested. The point I'm making here is that announcing that you have a volunteer opportunity is unlikely to recruit volunteers. There are different ways in which we need to recruit volunteers, and just getting up and saying there's a vacancy doesn't get you any more volunteers. Recruitment is a joint activity. Recruitment is an activity for volunteer recruitment is an activity for the whole organisation. Everybody in that organisation needs to be involved in doing this. They need to know how to say to somebody that they meet casually at a party or whatever else, do you want to become involved in this organisation? Here, this is what you do. Call this number, go to this place on the website, talk to me, come along to this event. All those things are about recruiting volunteers, and everybody in your organisation needs to be able to say to people, this is how we do it, and this is how you continue to get involved. One of the things which we tried at the Sydney Heritage Fleet was to give all our volunteers business cards. And on one side of the card it said, so-and-so, 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 Sydney Heritage Fleet, stoker, topman, rigger, whatever else. On the other side it said whatever they wanted to put on the card. And so the other side of the card might say garbage truck driver, or heart surgeon, or whatever the person was. But when they presented the card to somebody, they were also saying, and this is another aspect of what I do. And the bit which created the discussion was the volunteer. It was what that person was doing as a volunteer. How did you become a steam engineer? I thought they'd all died. Well, yes, they had, but we started retraining them, those kind of things. How did you become a rigger? Well, I've been learning to do this for a long time. That's much more interesting to most people in a social setting than, oh yeah, well actually I'm an accountant, or I'm an auditor, or I'm an actuary, or any of the other things which tend to finish conversations immediately and mean that you move on to something else. Recruit for a lifetime. but plan for the volunteer's term. I found that I was guilty of recruiting a volunteer to a particular position, and having done that, I'd move on to the next task. My presumption being that once the volunteer was in place and was adequately supported, I'd resolve that problem and my focus of attention should move on. I'd suggest very strongly that every volunteer recruitment you put a fixed term on. It doesn't matter if you want to, if both of you want that person to stay in the post for longer than that fixed term, but by doing that you ensure that there's a review point. You ensure that people say, okay, do we want to continue doing this? Is there another opportunity you'd rather do? Is there something else in the organisation which is of interest to you? You ensure that there is a continuing development for your volunteers, and by doing that you help to retain those volunteers. Do not be surprised if somebody who's been doing the same thing in your organisation or mine for the last years gets a better offer from somewhere else. As I've said, volunteers are often involved in more than one organisation, and if they find something which is more imaginative or whatever else, they're likely to go and spend their time there. But also volunteers' personal circumstances change, and they change remarkably quickly. Don't assume that no means don't ever ask me again. If you ask somebody if they're prepared to volunteer and the response is no, that doesn't mean don't ever ask me again. It just means give it a bit of time and come back and say, I know you weren't interested in that opportunity, but there's a different opportunity, or what is it that you'd like to do in the organisation? Keep having those conversations. I've lost a couple of great volunteers because I didn't go back to them and say, you know, you told me a year ago that you didn't want to do this. I'm assuming that that continues. I just made the assumption instead of giving the person the opportunity to change their position. Don't fill chairs for the sake of it. By this, I mean there are critical volunteer roles in every organisation. The temptation is always to put somebody in the role. If you don't put the best person in that role, then you're likely to spend more time supporting that individual than you would do re-recruiting somebody else. Make sure the person you've got in the chair fits the role. And don't be tempted just to put somebody there because you're stressed or whatever else. And there's occasionally incredible pressure to do that. You know? But my experience is that tends to backfire. So how do we do this? Some ideas. One of the things that we've trialled and is very effective was to run regular induction days. We did this on a monthly basis, and everybody in the organisation knew when those induction days were and knew to say to somebody, if you're interested in this organisation, ring up, book a place, it's entirely free, come along to the induction day. At those induction days, we found that we got about 25 people 11 times a year. We were doing about 275 inductions on an annual basis, something like that. This was an organisation with a volunteer workforce of between 550 and 600. We needed to replace about 20% of that figure. We needed about 100 volunteers a year just to maintain numbers, something like that. And we found that we could do that through this method. People came along to the induction because they had no idea what the organisation was about. And we were going to show them around a shipyard, we were going to show them around a tall ship, we were going to tell them how the organisation started, we were going to provide them with a series of opportunities. That was a fascinating thing to do in its own right. That was a good day out and it was free. When we got people there, we found that we could turn them into members, and that provided a revenue stream. We could recruit people as volunteers, and we could continue to increase the exposure of that organisation to an audience that we would not otherwise have had the opportunity to speak to. So this was good, useful stuff. You need to do the paperwork. Recruitment, retention and management, or recruitment and retention in particular, are about making sure that you're absolutely clear about what it is you're trying to do. You need to have a position description. It doesn't have to be long, doesn't have to be complicated, and you don't have to sit there as a group for half an hour scratching your heads going, is there anything we've missed? Position descriptions only need to say what the major tasks are that you want that role to accomplish, and the person specification is derived from the position description. If we want this person to cook, What are the personal attributes we need of this individual? Well, probably they ought to have some reasonable idea about personal hygiene would be one thing. I'm using an extreme example in this case. You also need to know what questions you're going to ask that person. Those questions are derived from the person specification. Each one of these 3 very simple documents, and they shouldn't run to more than a couple of pages at the very most, follow like, night follows day. When you've got people there, publicise what opportunities you've got. What are the roles that we've got here? Ask people which ones they're interested in. Give them the position descriptions. If you possibly can, do a short informal interview. That only need be 5-10 minutes whilst you're going through your induction. And have the people there who can do that. And if somebody's interested, all you're doing is going through the predetermined interview questions with the individual, and you're ticking them off, or you're scoring them, or you're doing whatever. If you then have time to do your OH&S, your Occupational Health and Safety induction, as part of this, and we found that we could do that, then by the time somebody's gone through the induction, they're ready to start work. The next day, they're up and running. And that's when they're most enthusiastic. If you can say to somebody, come along to this, and we'll do the induction, 2 weeks' time or a week's time or whatever, there's the training, or you've had sufficient training, we can now start you on the job. This is what I'd suggest a position description, person spec and interview questions look like. And I've just given an example here of a ship's cook. And one of the things I would expect a cook to do is to provision that vessel. That therefore means they need to be a good planner. You need to know what it is you're going to buy, how you're going to get it there, where you're going to put it, how you're going to store it, what the storage requirements are. This is all about planning. Probably the question is therefore, please describe how you go about the process, and you can assess somebody's capability by that. But the task, the personal skill requirement, and the interview question just follow one after the other. Control the temptation to ask the candidate, how often do you get seasick? I know it's important for a ship's cook, but you'll just waste 10 minutes in an interview talking about the greatest seasickness stories you've had, and they're going to lie to you anyway. They're going to say, no, I do not get seasick. And we all do. We know that. So there's not a lot of point in asking the question. Do not be diverted by that kind of thing. I know people want to get stuck into this. If you want to make sure you're going to recruit the best person for the job, you have to have a system. There are increasing legislative and regulatory requirements for us to have to prove that we've recruited the best person for the job. But we also owe it to our volunteers to be able to say, you're the best people we were able to recruit to this. You are the best that we have been able to get our hands on. And to be able to prove that. That system means that you will get the best. And that you can prove, if necessary, that you've got the best. It's also a source of considerable satisfaction, I think, to your existing volunteers. You can't all the time invite people to come to an induction, and you may have positions within your organisation where you need a very specific set of skills. If you were recruiting somebody for, I don't know, a board member or a training supervisor or something like that within an organisation, you'd probably want to headhunt them. And this simply reflects what happens normally in staff recruitment. Sometimes you advertise and headhunt, sometimes you just headhunt. I'm suggesting that for volunteers this is exactly the same. You need to do the paperwork. You need the position description, the person spec, the interview questions. Shortlisting then becomes a group task. Everybody in your organisation, you simply ask, who can you think of who might be prepared to do this? And this is the roles that we've got. You've got the position description there. So you're saying to everybody, okay, here's the position description. Who can do that? Here's the person characteristics. Who can you think of who has those characteristics? Draw up a short list. And then work out who's going to go and talk to each one of those people. Make sure you say to the people you're approaching, we are approaching more than one person, if that's the case. If you're only approaching one person, I suggest you don't tell them that either, for very obvious reasons. But asking people and then going through that process of scrutineering is likely to get you better quality candidates. Retention of volunteers. And I'm sure you guys have got some excellent ways of doing this, and you've developed them which are appropriate to your own organisations. Making volunteers a fixed length opportunity. I've already talked about this, but it is important. Presuming upon volunteers' goodwill to go on and on and on just burns out volunteers, just means that you have people who are unhappy with the organisation. Appreciation and recognition. Every opportunity you've got to thank volunteers, you take, and I'm sure you all do that. But having done that, then work out other ways to thank volunteers. Talk to some of your sponsors. One of the nice things for sponsors to be able to do is to fund a volunteer thank you event of some kind or a volunteer thank you opportunity. The most extreme example I ever came across of this was from an American university, Texas A&M University at College Station. The student leadership team there were flown on a private jet, which was provided by a sponsor, from the airfield, which was part of Texas A&M University, to New York to meet other Texas A&M alumni who might be able to provide them with a job, and presented as the best people from Texas A&M. Now, I'm not suggesting that you try and mirror those things within your own organisations, but they had come up with a particular way of rewarding their volunteers, and it was a very effective one. Rewards. There is some contention, I think, probably about providing rewards in volunteer organisations. If people are giving you money or you're having to fundraise for this, then giving some of that money to your volunteers may not be seen as the best way of going. Therefore, I would always suggest that any reward program which provides a monetary value to people, and I'm not suggesting you give people money, but you might give people memorabilia or whatever else, you provide the opportunity for people simply to refuse it and say, no, I'd rather this money was used to further the objectives of the organisation. We've used rewards programs to overcome some social and organisational problems. For example, we are running a shipyard with about 250 people in it, and the culture in the shipyard is completely different from the culture on a ship. You would expect there to be a chain of command in a ship, and you would expect people to respond to an instruction. You try giving somebody an instruction in a shipyard and see what happens. They'll bounce a rivet off your skull or throw a spanner at you or do whatever else. The culture is completely different. We had problems with people's personal dress in terms of our occupational health and safety. If somebody's riveting something or somebody's using a welding torch, it's a good idea they don't wear shorts. It's a good idea they've got a boiler suit or a coverall or an overall, whatever you call it. We couldn't get people to buy their own overalls, so what we did was to include within our reward program, if you do 100 hours, we'll give you a suit of overalls, and we'll embroider it with your name on it. We now have 200 people, ranging from 92 years old to 16, strutting around the shipyard with overalls on, which have got their name and the corporate logo on it. The occupational health and safety problem is considerably reduced, but at the same time there is an increased pride in what people are doing. It also means that the crews on all our other ships, on the smaller ships, we never had a problem with people wearing a uniform on the James Craig, but on all the other ships, people were very reluctant to wear uniforms. And the problem was they wanted to wear a uniform, but they wanted to design their own. Probably the most contentious thing you can do is to ask your volunteers what they think the uniform should be, because you will never get out of that argument. You will never actually solve that conundrum. So one of the things that we did was to say, okay, if you do 100 hours, you get $50 worth of memorabilia. That includes, one of the items that includes is a crew shirt, and we'll embroider it for you. And again, we started to get people, and we've now got people on the smaller vessels all wearing the same uniform. We had stokers, we had people in stokeholds who'd made their own uniforms. They included kind of admiral stripes around their sleeves and just about any other kind of badge or insignia. It was pretty dumb, because if you're shoveling coal for 15 minutes, then it really doesn't matter what colour your uniform was to begin with. It certainly isn't you're not going to be able to see the emblems on it after that. But Reward programs which reinforce what you're doing, your other objectives, do work. Clear guidance and appropriate leadership. Leadership is appropriate to the situation you're in. I gave the example of on a ship and in a shipyard. Different situations require different leadership styles. In terms of volunteers, the leadership style always needs to be inclusive. If volunteers say, I wasn't heard, or I couldn't be heard, or people ignored my suggestion, you start that process of volunteers disengaging from the organisation. In terms of ownership, if a volunteer team can determine their own work methods, then you should provide them with the opportunity to do that. Not always possible on a ship at sea. In fact, it's probably not possible on a ship at sea. But in terms of your planning within the organisation, maintenance work and so on and so forth, it's perfectly possible for people to do that. And by doing that, you will improve the motivation and the retention of your volunteers. Provide training, self-evident. We all know this. I found in volunteer organisations, too often the training depends upon one individual who has the knowledge or the motivation to do this, and that training gets passed down from one individual to the next. As a result of that, it changes. People's memory isn't always infallible. There is a requirement to document training and to make sure that it's delivered as and when needed, but that it's delivered consistently, that the same training is done with the same training outcomes. You always include everybody as part of your team. We all know that. More appreciation. Once you thank people, you then start thinking about the next way to thank them all over again. And review the position, and where it's appropriate, provide feedback. The feedback is a two-way thing. Your managers and supervisors should be asking the people that they're managing or supervising for feedback about the way in which they're doing their own roles. And I'll come on to the next point, which is why management of volunteers is a humbling experience. This, I think, is fundamental to volunteer management and to the approach of people who are involved in volunteer management. They are not our volunteers. We are their manager, and by that I mean they possess us, not we possess them. The role of the manager or the supervisor or whatever it is in a volunteer organisation is to support and provide resources to the volunteers. And by doing that, we ensure that we retain volunteers, but also that we have positively motivated volunteers. The moment, in my experience, that you start saying to volunteers, you do this, with the exception of a ship at sea, and I put that to one side for a moment, then you tend to start losing people. And it's a concept, and it takes a long time to get your head round, because the egos of most managers, particularly most staff managers, suggest what I should be doing is organising other people. No, you should be making sure that those people are organised, and the most effective way of doing that is to assist them to organise themselves. This comes back to the point that volunteer management is a developmental operation. It's a personal development operation. It is entirely synonymous with the challenges that we put in front of SAIL trainees and which they respond to day in and day out. Volunteers will respond in exactly the same way, and certainly will in my experience. Dealing with complaints and grievances, there will be complaints, there will be grievances. Usually, the people involved in the grievance or the people involved in the complaint are the only people who can resolve it. This is about two people not communicating with each other, not understanding each other, or whatever else, or just going at each other hammer and tongs. Well, it doesn't matter what it is. The only people who can resolve that are the people involved in the complaint. There is no point in becoming involved in that unless you can make a positive contribution, and there is no point in kicking complaints and grievances up to a board who have even less of an opportunity to be able to resolve those complaints. And so my suggestion is that you always come back to this. The only way this is going to be resolved is if the two of you talk to each other. No, I can't talk to them, they won't listen, etc. It doesn't matter. The only way this is going to be resolved is if the two of you can talk to each other, and that's usually the way in which it happens. Dealing with suggestions and ideas. the Sydney Heritage Fleet, 550 volunteers. I reckon every one of those people had what they considered to be 3 or 4 brilliant ideas. Sometimes it felt like they were having them every week, but in effect there was probably 3 or 4 per person per year. That's still a couple of thousand, 2,500 ideas. Many of those ideas were the same, and many of them were things which other people had thought of earlier on. Absolutely essential that there was a suggestion scheme, that you could say to people, we've listened to what you say, and that we have dealt with it in the following way. The delightful thing about having ideas is it's fun, it's motivating. We all know that. And when you've had an idea, the best time to implement that idea is as soon as you've had it, which is why everybody rushes off. We're never going to have as much energy to implement that idea as we do at the time that we've had the idea. The problem with that is that we haven't qualified those ideas. So whilst ideas are fun, they're also cheap. Qualified ideas, ideas by which I mean ideas which you have worked out how you're going to implement, are valuable. They require effort to qualify. You need to get people together and work out how you're going to do it. But the only way you get qualified ideas is if you have a stream of individual suggestions to begin with. So a suggestion management scheme, I think, is probably important. Managing up in volunteer organisations, not going to spend much time in that because it's probably the subject of a complete training course. The way in which we manage the volunteer boards of organisations is of key importance to the way in which we develop strategy within voluntary organisations, self-training organisations, but we really don't have time or space to do that. What I am going to do is to hand over to Finn, who's going to give you a brilliant exposition of volunteer management in the Port of Dublin during the last tall ships race there. Thank you. Finn.
Just a quick word of introduction to Finn. Finn is an Irish lady. She graduated from University College Cork with a Master in Business. She joined Asgard 2 as a trainee while still in university and was bosun on Asgard 2 in a professional capacity from 1999 to 2008. She has taken part in the Tall Ship series in each of those years and included 2 transatlantic tall ship races. Since the loss of Asgard 2 in 2008, she's been involved in various different projects. She was headed up with Colin Newport, the liaison officer volunteers in Dublin 2012, and at present she is restoring a 12.5 metre Colin Archer vessel, which Colin and herself hope to use for sail training around the Irish coast, and she's currently in a sailmaker's as an apprentice in Copenhagen. Finn Goggin.
Hi. This is new to me, the volunteering side, as Callan said earlier. I used to be at sea, so Dublin Tall Ships was my first experience of working as a volunteer myself and working with a group of volunteers. Very quickly, our volunteers for Dublin Tall Ships, there was 1,000 volunteers, from stewarding to looking after the structures. Our sole focus was the volunteer liaison officers. It was our opportunity. On ships, you always look for the super liaison officer when you go into port, the person that you want to meet, the person that will look after your ship and give you the best experience in that port. This was our opportunity to say, this is the ideal liaison officer that we want. This is the kind of person that we want the ships coming to Dublin to meet. So we had this experience ourselves, and we wanted to bring this to Dublin Tall Ships. There was a management team, which we'll go through later, of 8 people, all with seafaring background. And then we had our team leaders and our liaison officers, which were just a random mix of people brought together for a Tall Ships event. One of our thoughts on this, we all know the coffee drinkers, the volunteers that come along with the best of intentions, and they sit and they drink coffee. And if they're not managed correctly, or if they're not instructed or trained correctly, that can be all that they do. So this was one of our first requirements, no coffee drinkers. We had work to do, and we wanted to make sure people were aware of this from the word go, or from the start. Our recruitment of those 110, or of the 1,000 volunteers for the entire event, came through a recruitment agency. This was not our decision. This was how it was organised for us as such. The role of our liaison officer, most people that came to the recruitment agency as volunteers did not know what a liaison officer was. They heard of a liaison officer. They heard in 98 when Tall Ships were there. They met other liaison officers and they thought, oh, this is going to be a great job, easy, and I'll be part of the event. Not so. The information on volunteers was very important. As much information as we could get at the start would make our job of making good liaison officers and matching them to the correct role. It made it easier the more information we got. The availability before the actual event, it's really important to know, are your liaison officers only going to be available for 3 or 4 days, or could you potentially have them for a week before the event? As it turns out, in Dublin, the ships came in early, 3 or 4 days. They came in on Monday instead, or on Sunday actually, instead of Thursday. So having that knowledge was really important to us, and it allowed us to call the people in early, and that was vital. Languages, quite important. Other skills, obviously not enthusiastic amateurs that thought they were good with electrical cabling or whatever. These were all certified people that were able to say to us, this is another skill I have. And we were able to use that in the technical team. We were able to match them to the jobs we wanted to put them into. Previous maritime experience, very useful for us. Again, it sort of got us past that stage of telling them, this is a ship, this is the front of the ship, this is the back of the ship. We were a level above that again. We were lucky we had many people with maritime experience. We had a selection criteria. Again, it was based on, there was languages, there was availability. Our availability, we specifically said you have got to be available for a minimum of 3 days. There were people that said, I can do a half an hour or an afternoon one day, or I can do 2 afternoons. We said no to that because it meant that there was no continuity for the ships. They would have had a different person in the afternoon to who they had the following day. So we specified that people had to be available from 8 in the morning till 8 at night for a minimum of 3 days. That was a very important part of it, sorry. Another one was that part of the selection criteria, we were hoping we could say that we only wanted people from Dublin because we wanted them to have the local knowledge and to be able to give that information to the ships. We weren't allowed to say it because of the volunteer recruitment agency. They said, no, we have to take everyone. So we didn't really have control over who we got into the volunteer position. The control as such, or our influence, came later through the training. Team leaders. We had 10 team leaders who each had 10 people. All of those team leaders were known to us previously, and I think it was 8 out of 10 of them had sailed on Asgard. So they had sailed in a sail training ship, and they had gone to, a lot of them had been to Tall Ships ports. They knew exactly what they themselves would have wanted and what was expected of them. So again, we didn't have to tell these people, they knew. So we were very lucky with that also. A lot of time, again, spent matching people to jobs. There were certain people that were very unfit, let's say, and we could say, right, okay, you want to stay in the recreational centre, and they were delighted with that because they were still involved. Or we had engineers that went to the technical, there was a technical group, they stayed with them. So we matched people up as best we could. And again, it was the kind of person that we ourselves wished to meet when we were at sea ourselves. So this was constantly in our heads. The management team, 8 of us in total. I say recruitment through hijacking. It started with Liam, our main guy, and he would bring another person on board, and that person brought another person, and everybody got pulled into the group because they knew someone else, and everybody had maritime experience. So within the group of 8, again, there was nobody that was unaware of what was required of them, and we were all working for the same thing, or for the same end goal, let's say. The liaison officers themselves, I mentioned earlier, all ages, all over Ireland, many with no marine experience and very few with a real understanding of what the liaison officer role was, but full of enthusiasm. They wanted to be involved. They wanted to be part of the success of making the event a success. This is where we got to impart what we thought was the ideal liaison officer. This is where we could train them. This is where we could tell them what was required. We gave them, there was a training day broken into 2 modules, an A and a B. We gave them a choice. They had to complete it. It was a requirement. We gave them the choice over a month-long period so that people that were going on holidays, we weren't going to lose them because they couldn't attend a particular training day. They had to complete this over whatever choice of days they wished. And the main aim of it was to bring them from a shoresider to a seafarer or a ship's agent in a very short period of time, as in a day. The event was fully explained. When the ships come in, how they come in, what's expected as soon as the ship ties up alongside. Really basic things, but if you've never experienced an event like that before, it's completely new. The role of the LO was fully explained, what was required of them, attending their daily briefings, being the bridge between the ship and the shore, making sure that the ship got maximum benefit out of all the facilities being offered by the port. Really, really important, making sure they knew about the sports events, and again, making sure the port got the most out of the ship's visits. So it was a mutually beneficial arrangement. Making sure they went to the sports events, making sure they got information in a timely manner. If there were problems, making sure that those problems from the ship were instantly given to the management team so that we could deal with them quickly and effectively. Code of conduct, again, they had to wear the liaison T-shirts, no drinking when they were working. That didn't always go to plan. But we were very straight and very direct in what was required of them, so there was no ambiguity. People were aware of what the rules as such were. The role-specific training, we had things like safe access, means of access to the ship, gangways. People never heard of a gangway in their lives, a lot of them before. Tides, a ship's hierarchy. Don't go to the ship's crew telling them what you're going to plan for their day. Go through the ship's captain or the mate or whatever first, explaining all of that. Communications, again, making sure it's a big site, a tall ship site, making sure that they knew how to contact where we were based, the management team, where the operations centre was, making sure they knew that phone coverage could very well go down at a very busy event. They had UHF radios, the team leaders, so the team leader was in constant contact with them. And mainly communications was based on mobile phones, their own mobile phones. Site briefing, again, the days leading up to the event, we got the team leaders particularly, but also any available liaison officers that were there early. We walked them around the site, so they knew where the recreation centre was. They knew where the mobile race office would be. They knew where the showers were. They knew where the sports events were going to be. Again, so that any time they were asked, they were able to give the answer and they didn't have to say, I'm going to check or I'll get back to you on it. The information was constantly being given. That's the events description, also taking in the sports events, the cultural events, opening ceremonies, crew parades, again, full information. Emergencies, what to do when things go wrong, if someone falls over the side or someone hurts themselves on the ship, again, making sure that they were aware of the way to get it sorted. And again, we gave them the opportunity then to ask us any questions that they needed answering. At this stage, there were a number of people that dropped out, which was okay because we felt we had given them full information. They knew what the job entailed, and at that stage they could say, I'm in for this is great, or they could leave. And if they left, that was fine. It meant that they weren't leaving the day of the event and suddenly we were without liaison officers. We preferred that they leave early than late. We didn't have too much of it, actually. This is something we found, because they're not working for financial gain. You're getting the pure enthusiasm and wanting to be part of something better. The money didn't matter. Money wasn't the reason they were doing it, for the most part. Well, it wasn't, because they got none. So that was very important. The managing and motivating morning briefings were key. Every day they had to attend at 8 a.m. this morning briefing. Some mornings it was very entertaining. It was our way of just gathering them all together and saying, okay, guys, we're here, reiterating the goal to make it the most successful event and to constantly say it's about the ships. Yes, other people were more concerned about the port or about the events surrounding it, the concerts and all of those things. We were very blunt. We didn't care about any of the other things. We were caring about the ships and only the ships. So we were able to give the information. Things changed on a daily basis. There were issues with delivery of stores, ship stores. That was constantly being changed. The traffic management plan was being changed, and we could give that information to them in a timely manner every day, or a timely manner. So it was one meeting every day. We had information to give to the ships. We gave that. We gave it to the captains. We constantly reiterating what they needed to let the captains and the ship's crew know. Again, making sure they knew about sports events and all the different things that were available for the ship's crews. Team leaders, again, it was also important to draw the team leaders in together, the 10 team leaders who we knew previously, and to make sure that they were happy with their 10 liaison officers and that they were constantly checking up that those liaison officers were happy with the jobs they were doing. I should have said earlier, we had, I think it was it 43 ships? So we had on average 2 liaison officers for each ship. For the larger ships, we had 3. So even the smallest boat had 2 liaison officers. So it sort of, we were slightly even oversubscribed, but it worked. The management team, that was the 8 people. As such, we had this schematic, this hierarchy thing. There was none. It was like a room like this. There was 8 of us there all the time. The liaison officers came in and out. In theory, the team leaders were the ones that would have been giving us the information, but it wasn't. Everyone came in and out. They knew us all by name, and they could go to any one of us. So that was quite important too, that it was very open and it was easy to access us if they needed an answer. Issues quickly dealt with. That was really important. Again, if you're not able to have an answer for them, that's when doubt creeps in, or somebody tells another person gives the wrong answer, or says, oh, I'm not sure, the stories change, and then suddenly the ships are given the wrong information, or times are changed, or whatever. And the importance of being decisive. Again, we had to be timely. We had to give answers when they were required. If we didn't have the answer, we had to have access to the information very quickly. Needs of the ship, needs of the volunteer. Obviously, our volunteers, they were absolutely amazing in their time, in their commitment, their time commitment mainly, but their enthusiasm and just their effort. They needed to be fed. They needed a place to come to hang out when the ships didn't need them. That was very important that they were looked after. We would have liked to have done a little bit more in terms of giving them phone credit. They used their phones privately, and they got they got 10 euros afterwards, but we would have liked to have given them phones to use and try to even look after them more, but we couldn't. We were budget constraints, and we were constantly being told there isn't the money for it. So they really had to be satisfied with being told constantly what a good job they were doing and how important they were to the success of the event. They were the linchpin, as far as we were concerned, to the entire event. Again, leading into happy ships, happy crew, and because there was such a positive feeling all the time, after the first day or two, when ships weren't expecting, they came in early, they weren't expecting services to be available, And they were so relieved and so happy when things were dealt with quickly. It just fed back. We were getting positive feedback all the time, and we kept giving that back out. And it just fed off itself. It really did. And that was a hugely motivating thing. We had a couple of things, and it was alcohol related, where we had to let go a couple of liaison officers. And that was the only negative thing, but it was a really hard, it was a very hard thing to pass into a group of people and say, look, this has happened, this is how we're dealing with it, black and white, no drink, so you can't be a liaison officer anymore. It was the only negative thing, but it was very hard to bring that into a very positive group as they were. But it was mainly the only thing. If we were to do it all over again, the recruitment process did cause us, give us a lot more paperwork because it was a recruitment agency. We would say that you could quite happily go to the local sailing clubs, you could go to the yacht clubs, you could go to the scouting groups, and you could quite easily get those people, those numbers that you require. By going more formally, you have more, there was a lot more paperwork, there was a lot more criteria, selection criteria, and to be honest, there was a lot of time wasted. We weren't really paperwork people. We just wanted to get the job done. We knew what was required. So there's an element, I would say, we didn't have a lot of control over the recruitment. We were very happy with how it turned out. They were a really good team, but that's an area where I think you could go to a lot more, as I say, the sailing clubs, and use those a lot more. Legislation, you have to be aware of the legislation in your own country. Because we went through a formalised recruitment process, we then had to deal with minimum hours of work legislation, and certain people said, oh, you can't have people working from 8 to 8. And we were saying, well, you can, they're volunteers, but you have to deal with that, and you have to know what your answers to it are. You have to deal with the health and safety thing of life jackets on a quay wall, or life jackets. If you have people working on a quayside, are they required to wear life jackets? If so, that's 110 life jackets that you've suddenly got to buy, and make sure they're fully serviced. So there's those kind of issues. Other things like police vetting. If you're taking volunteers on board, that's another thing. You have to know it, because we learned on the job. We didn't know it automatically, but it slowed everything down, because all these things take time. So those things are very important to be aware of. The importance of marine experience for the management team, because there was people with tall ships experience, was extremely important. We knew, we've been there, we know what ships want, we know what we always wanted when we went into port. That was incredibly important. Not just tall ships experience, all of the 8 team members were Coast Guard, lifeboats, master mariners, pilots, marina managers. That was invaluable, again, because the information was there all the time, and if they didn't know it, they knew someone else. And it was just a very small group. Marine anywhere, a tall ships group, it's a small world. You all know each other. Utilise it. Use those people. That's basically it. Overall, it was an incredible experience, personally, as a volunteer, but for the liaison officers, all of them, again, as regards to recruitment, for another event, should Dublin go again, all of them came back and said, yeah, definitely, count me in next time. And again, keeping those people, keeping the contacts with those people, and saying, yeah, definitely, we would use you again if we could, if it were to arise again. Thank you very much. Welcome.